EBSCOR, the experimental program to stimulate competitive research, is a National Science Foundation grant program. The goal of EBSCOR is to strengthen science and engineering research and education throughout the United States, and to enable states like Wyoming to be nationally competitive in these areas. EBSCOR aims to improve scientific infrastructure in Wyoming and build science, technology, engineering, and math research capacity across the state. One way Wyoming EBSCOR helps strengthen science research and education is through student programs such as the Summer Research Apprentice Program, also known as SRAP. SRAP is an intensive 6-week paid research experience for high school sophomores, juniors, and seniors aiming to attend college. It offers students a hands-on research opportunity in science labs across the University of Wyoming campus. Students work one-on-one with a faculty mentor throughout their time in the program. SRAP not only provides students with a paid internship and real research experience, but also helps prepare them for college life.
I'd like to introduce Ms. Maddie Zoltek from Bloomingdale, Illinois. She'll be presenting effects of dopamine polymerization time on performance of PEM fuel cells.
Hi, my name is Maddie Zoltek, and I studied with Dr. Katie Lee and Phil Cross from the Chemical and Petroleum Engineering Department here at University of Wyoming. And my project was studying the effect of dopamine polymerization time on the performance of PEM fuel cells. So a fuel cell is a device that creates electricity electrochemically through oxidation reduction reactions involving hydrogen and oxygen. In a proton exchange membrane fuel cell, or a PEM fuel cell, hydrogen is used as the fuel. It enters at the anode, which is right here. Hydrogen enters the anode where it's oxidized with the aid of a catalyst. And in this experiment, we use platinum as a catalyst. And oxidation means that the hydrogen is split into protons and electrons. Now, the protons are able to pass directly through the membrane right here. However, the electrons are repelled by the membrane and are forced in a circuit around the cell. And this movement of electrons is what creates the electricity. When the electrons reach the other side of the fuel cell, it's known as the cathode. It reunites with the protons, and oxygen gas enters the cathode at the same time and combines with the hydrogen. This creates water, and these reactions are all seen right here. And the only emissions of the fuel cell are water and excess heat. So there are a lot of benefits to fuel cells, especially in the 21st century now with growing concerns of air pollution. One of the most advantageous reasons we want fuel cells is their low emissions. Right now in cars, internal combustion engines emit a lot of harmful gases into the air, including carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. They also emit nitrogen oxides and hydrocarbons. And according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, 1 gallon of gas emits 25 pounds of harmful gases into the atmosphere. So fuel cells are effective because they only emit water and heat. Another reason that fuel cells are beneficial are that they are highly efficient. Right now, in internal combustion engines in cars, the engines have efficiencies of around 16 to 20%, and fuel cells are expected to have efficiencies of up to 3 times that amount, which would give them efficiencies of over 50%. Finally, they generate reliable and high-quality power. Fuel cells aren't connected to the electrical grid, so they don't have the same negative effects that come with that. So in the event of a power outage, fuel cells make excellent backup power applications, like in hospitals and grocery stores and data centers where they need constant power. Fuel cells would be very beneficial. This diagram here shows how a fuel cell would be set up in a fuel cell powered car. The hydrogen tank is right here next to the fuel cell stack. And then there's the battery, the PC or process control unit, the air compressor, and the electric motor. Now there are also drawbacks to using fuel cells right now, and one of the primary drawbacks is its high cost. A catalyst is needed in a fuel cell to oxidize the hydrogen at the anode and to generate water at the cathode. Right now, the best catalyst is platinum, and in the experiment that we performed, platinum cost over $100 per gram. And right now, that is not cost effective enough to be able to be commercialized. Another issue with fuel cells is the source of hydrogen. In order for a fuel cell to work, hydrogen needs to be located right next to the fuel cell. And in a car, that means that there's only limited storage space. So the car would have to refuel more often than a typical gasoline-powered car right now. Finally, durability is an issue with fuel cells. In a fuel cell, the anode and the cathode must remain firmly adhered to the membrane in order for it to function properly and for a long period of time. And as research has shown, the anode and cathode become slightly disattached from the membrane as time goes on, and that results in decreased performance. So we need to find a way to make the membrane more adhesive, and one way of doing that is through the use of dopamine. The idea to use dopamine in research was actually inspired by mussels, which are organisms that live under the sea and are known for their ability to adhere to almost any surface. The reason for this adherence is dopamine amino acid groups in the surface of mussels. Dopamine is able to self-polymerize in the presence of oxygen. Polymerization is a process where a bunch of small molecules called monomers combine together to make a bigger molecule known as a polymer, and it has unique properties. In the case of dopamine, dopamine combines with oxygen to create a molecule known as polydopamine, which can be seen up here. And this polydopamine is very adhesive. When a substrate is immersed in a polydopamine solution, it allows the layer of polydopamine to be formed on the substrate, and that makes the substrate more adhesive. From this diagram, you can see that there's a lot of applications that this can be used for. And in fuel cell research, we use it to help the electrodes adhere more firmly to the membrane. So in this experiment, we created 2 fuel cells with 2 different Napheon-117 membranes. We immersed one membrane in an aqueous dopamine solution for 10 minutes, and the other membrane was immersed for 2 hours. And we wanted to find out how the amount of polymerization time, or the amount of time that the membrane was immersed, affected the performance of the fuel cell. And we hypothesized that a longer polymerization time might increase the adherence of the electrodes to the fuel cell, but it would also block effective proton flow. The importance of this study is that we're learning how durability of fuel cells is affected. If we know how polymerization time affects the performance of fuel cells, we can find an optimum dopamine polymerization time that will allow us to maximize both the performance of the fuel cell and its durability. And if we can make a durable fuel cell, that will overcome a significant obstacle in the commercialization of fuel cells. So to begin this experiment, we cleaned 2 Napheon-117 membranes by boiling them for 1 hour in a hydrogen peroxide solution, 1 hour in distilled water, and 1 hour in a sulfuric acid solution. And to create the dopamine solution, we made a 2 milligram per milliliter dopamine solution with dopamine, trace buffer, and distilled water. We stirred it and it turned a slight brownish color. And then we immersed the membranes in the solution. One membrane was immersed for 10 minutes, the other was immersed for 2 hours. And once the immersion time was complete, we took them out, rinsed them with distilled water, and placed them in distilled water until further use. To create the catalyst, we made a platinum ink with ethanol, naphthalene solution, and platinum. And we sonicated it for 30 minutes. And sonication means that we use vibration to separate particles. And it was stored in a sealed container until further use. We painted the ink onto 2 pieces of carbon paper that we cut into 5 centimeter squared area squares. And 1 layer of ink was painted onto one side of each carbon paper. It was allowed to dry for 1 hour, and then 1 more layer was painted on. And these carbon papers were heat pressed to the membrane, the dopamine-coated membrane, at 135 degrees Celsius and 80 psi for 90 seconds. We did 3 different tests on the fuel cell. The first test was a linear sweep voltammetry test, or an LSV test, and that measured the amount of hydrogen permeation through the fuel cell and also signaled whether an electrical short occurred in the fuel cell. The second test we ran was an ECSA, or an electrochemical catalytic surface area test, and that showed us the amount of active catalytic surface area on the membrane. And the final test we ran was a performance test in which we changed the current and saw what kind of potential or voltage we could get out of the fuel cell. And it was run at 3 different types of humidity, 1 at a low humidity, 1 at a mid-range humidity, and 1 at high humidity, to see how the amount of water vapor in the cell affected performance. So these are the linear sweep voltammetry results for the day 1 10-minute polymerization time fuel cell. From this graph, we can deduce that there is no electrical short in the fuel cell, which is good. However, all other tests, both for the 10-minute and 2-hour polymerization time fuel cells, failed for the LSV test. And the reasoning behind this is that dopamine is a capacitor, which means that it can store charge. And the storage of electrons means that the LSV test can't give us accurate results. It interferes with the results. These are the ECSA results. Electrochemical catalytic surface area. In order to find the exact amount, you do a lot of complicated calculations, but we can find a relative or general idea of the amount by just looking at the graph. The shaded region on the graph shows the amount of charge, and the greater the amount of charge, the greater the amount of active catalytic surface area. The current shaded region right now shows the amount of charge for day 1, the first ECSA test that we ran on the 10-minute polymerization time fuel cell. This next region shows day 2, And the final region shows a later time on day 2. The ECSA test shows from this that as time goes on and the fuel cell is degraded, the amount of active catalytic surface area actually increased for the 10-minute polymerization time fuel cell. However, when we look at the 2-hour polymerization time fuel cell, we see no initial peak right here, which is this part of this graph, and that shows that there was no hydrogen absorption. And we also see no negative current here, which is down here on this graph. And the lack of negative current means that there was no active catalytic surface area on the 2-hour polymerization time fuel cell. The final test we ran was a performance test, and as I said earlier, it was run at 3 different humidities. Day 3 performance 10-minute polymerization time shows after the fuel cell was degraded, and for both day 2 and day 3, we can see that the fuel cell performed best at a high relative humidity. The performance test on the 2-hour polymerization time fuel cell also failed. So the 10-minute polymerization time fuel cell actually performed better than previous fuel cell made with a 30-minute polymerization time. Which shows us that a thinner layer of dopamine on the membrane will still allow the electrodes to adhere and also increase the performance. The reasoning behind the better performance at high relative humidity is that water reacts with the membrane in a way that allows protons to flow through the membrane more easily and quickly. The reasoning behind the 2-hour polymerization time fuel cell failing is because, as I mentioned earlier, dopamine self-polymerizes in the presence of oxygen. So when the membrane is immersed in an aqueous dopamine solution for a longer period of time, it allows the dopamine to self-polymerize for a longer period of time, and that makes a thicker layer of dopamine on the membrane. This thicker layer of dopamine blocks protons from flowing through the membrane, which resulted in the malfunction of the fuel cell. Future studies on this can include testing polymerization times between 0 and 180 minutes and finding an optimal polymerization time that would allow us to maximize both the performance of the fuel cell and keep its durability. These are my references. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Katie Lee and Phil Cross from the Chemical and Petroleum Engineering Department at the University of Wyoming for all the help they gave us. I'd like to thank Wyoming NSF EPSCoR for funding this program and allowing us to do this research. University of Wyoming SRAP program for an amazing summer. Lisa Beta, my lab partner Lydia Frost, and all the amazing SRAP staff and students for an unforgettable summer. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Beginning, you said in terms of combustion engine have efficiency of 17%, and fuel cell have efficiency of roughly 3 times as much, right? Do you mean by the ability of the fuel cell to generate electricity, or the ability for the car engine to utilize the electricity from the fuel cell?
The ability of the car engine to use the electricity. Any other questions? Yes.
If I understood you correctly, you did 2 aversions, one for 10 minutes and one for 2 hours.
Yes.
So that's just 2 data points.
Right.
What was the barrier to having more data points?
Time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we only had a few weeks. Once we decided on our projects, we only had a few weeks, and we didn't have enough time with both me and my lab partner testing fuel cells. There wasn't enough time. Yes.
So when a muscle is under C and it becomes fully saturated in its dopamine solution, if you will, and yet it seems like the 10-minute you said worked better, at least for adhesion. Do you think you know why that might be, that the shorter time frame worked better in this case, whereas the muscle is fully immersed in that kind of all the time?
Well, the reason that the 10-minute polymerization time worked better than the 2-hour polymerization time is because the thinner layer of dopamine allowed protons to pass through the fuel cell. So the 2-hour polymerization time most likely had better adherence, and so it was stickier, but it blocked proton flow, and so the fuel cell failed. Any other questions? Yes.
You give off the reactive production of electricity or energy. You give off heat in water. Right? You know how much heat is given off?
No, I don't have a number. Sorry. Anything else? Okay, thank you so much.